Welcome to the Histories of Northamptonshire podcast series, and this episode number 88. Recorded on location, each episode tells the story of one of the many and varied objects which are the focus of the exhibition A History of Northamptonshire in 100 Objects. The exhibition runs at the Northampton Museum and Art Gallery between the 20th of September 2025 and February 2026. Selected by local individuals, heritage groups and the museum's own curators, each object tells a different story from the county's past. And so, to our guest for this episode.
I'm Emily Bovellis, and I work at Northampton Museum and Art Gallery as part of the front of house team. My specialism in this area has come from my own lived experience with a long-term mental health condition. In my time working in the museum or just going to museums, I've observed that there's a lot of invisible narratives that aren't talked about or discussed, and one of those definitely is around mental health and mental health heritage. These rabbits particularly interest me because I think they tell a really interesting story about mental health heritage.
Tell me about the rabbits.
The rabbits are two toy rabbits that were made as part of an occupational therapy workshop at St Crispins Hospital. One of the rabbits was made during the 1950s, wearing a blue pinafore dress, and there is also a rabbit who is wearing a lovely groovy pair of orange velvet trousers. Made at a later period, around 1968. The other rabbit was made in the 1950s. They were gifted to children in the local area, and as far as we know, they were very cherished by the children that had them.
So these were made by people who had challenges?
Yes.
For themselves and then given to children, or made for the children?
They would have obviously been inpatients at St Crispins Hospital. Occupational therapy was a very popular form of therapy. It still is to this day. It started out as part of the moral treatment therapy. So Victorian asylums had a massive reform, and during that period, moral treatment is seen as a more holistic approach to dealing with mental health, which in a way it was a lot more humane. People were given tasks and jobs to do. They would make these things as what would be seen as a therapeutic approach, but often the objects they made were sold. I can't say that for certain with these objects because we don't know that for certain, but there is an element throughout sort of asylum history and that there was an exploitive element at certain points with these objects at times.
Okay, so there's a slightly dark connotation.
Definitely. That's the interesting thing about what I would call mental health heritage. It's a sort of newer concept that academics are bandying about because mental health heritage, or what we see as mental health heritage, has largely been ignored. There are a few asylum museums, but asylum museums tend to focus on the medical gaze because they're very medically based. They tend to focus on a medical lens. And they have dark connotations. So you can't avoid that with asylums. There is always going to be a dark connotation. I think it's a balancing act of how we view that nowadays. So on the one hand, objects tend to either be sensationalised or they tend to be sanitised. And I think we need to see a middle ground.
Why rabbits in particular as a form of therapy?
To be honest, I think it was just a case of that would be what they were making that day. So I think they would have made a variety of different dolls, a variety of different rabbits, or maybe that's what the patients chose to make.
I just wondered whether there was any parallel to children's books with things like, Peter Rabbit, those sorts of things that might have had a parallel, which somebody in the medical community would have said, that actually is a form of almost a return to childhood.
Yes.
In the making of these items.
I'm really glad you mentioned that. Yeah, I think that's a valid point. But Beatrix Potter and Peter Rabbit would certainly be a more calming element to it. I suppose bunny rabbits they're quite sweet and they're quite a popular toy.
They're pets for so many people.
Exactly. So, and especially I think during the 1950s, 1960s, they were a very popular pet.
The crafting of these things, these are considered pieces of work. Notwithstanding they might have been given or sold to children, there is craftsmanship in these.
Absolutely. The embroidery is beautiful, the detailing on the faces. They look brand new to this day. The work that's been put into them and the care that they've received from the people that looked after them as well. They were dearly loved, and you can see that. And I think that's interesting because that leads into an assumption that people in asylums wouldn't be skilled or wouldn't have a life beyond the asylum. Most of the people that went to asylums, like people nowadays with mental health conditions, they come from all walks of work, they come from all different skills. And what occupational therapy would do do, and still does to this day, is it would focus on what people were interested in, what people were skilled in. So if people were skilled at making and sewing and stitching, which obviously back then they would have been a lot more than nowadays. I think most of us have no clue how to sew nowadays. They would have definitely harnessed that and utilised that. And then probably they would have developed those skills in the asylum as well.
So when we're talking about creativity as a therapy, the degree of therapy in making something would have been considerable for that individual. This was very much focused on the individual and the journey they were making through the making of, in this case, a couple of toy rabbits.
I do agree with that. And whilst there's, there is the history of, potentially a sort of factory shop element to some asylums, the level of care, and there does seem to be a personal element to these rabbits, and I think that's why I'm so drawn to them, because I think whilst we don't know who made them, I think it definitely gives us a personal identity of mental health. It also allows us to humanise the people.
So a toy to a child, but a step along a path for the person making the toy. Was this crafting in the 1950s at the leading edge of attitudes towards mental well-being as delivered by St Crispins Hospital?
Yes, it would have been. So the arts and crafts movement of the sort of 19th century believed in this idea of the concept of the body and mind working together and keeping busy and keeping creative. And this was really embraced by asylums and psychiatric hospitals. I wouldn't say radical because it had already been used for quite a while, but it was still an interesting way of approaching therapy, and a kinder way and a more humanistic way.
These items were made at St Crispins Hospital. These items are in extremely good condition. Does that indicate that they've actually been put in a drawer somewhere, or that they really have been played with and truly loved by the child that received them?
That's a good question. And I wondered the same thing, especially when I was recently looking at them and I found the cards that were attached that mentioned the names of the girls that had them. So they were both owned by girls. We do have in the text that we were given that they were very cherished toys. Perhaps people looked after toys more back then. I don't know. It might not have been a favourite toy. It might just been one of their toys that they had in the collection.
We know where the items were made. We know where the items ended up. Do we know anything about the people who produced them, or is that something that is kept private for the individuals?
The people that would have received these dolls, they wouldn't have known at the time. And this leads into a key thing about invisible and hidden histories, especially in mental health heritage. We have countless records, and we have countless, for example, hundreds of asylum photographs of all these people. We don't really know much about them apart from their name, date, perhaps their occupation.
So what you're saying is treatment might have changed, but acknowledgement and embracing people with mental challenges, that perhaps has still some way to go in terms of the way society alters its attitudes.
Definitely. And I think by having these displayed in the exhibition, I think they allow us to ask questions. And I think that's what I want people to do when they come to view these objects. We talk about mental health a lot. Mental health is spoken about. But to me, it still feels like it's the tip of the iceberg.
Em, you were very open when you started talking to me in terms of your own lived experience. And we don't need to go into that for the purposes of the podcast. But you perhaps are attuned to the issues of people with mental challenges. What would your reaction have been if somebody had presented something like this to you as a little girl? Maybe not talking about the origin of it, but in terms of the love and the creativity that had gone into the making of that item, which you wouldn't necessarily have known about as a youngster.
My answer to that is going to show how stigma becomes attached to things. So as a little girl, especially the boy rabbit, I'm very attached to the boy rabbit. I would have been absolutely delighted to have received him. He's beautiful. As I mentioned, and I'm really disappointed that I didn't make that connection, I was a massive Beatrix Potter fan. So I would have definitely made that association with Peter Rabbit. As I would have got older, and I would have found out that it was made in an asylum, I'm ashamed to say, and I think we all would have felt the same, there would have been a little bit of a shock and horror with that. But why? And that's the key question I want people to think about. Why? Why are we shocked or horrified that someone that was unwell made this item? And why does that fill us with such horror and fear?
This exhibition is about the histories of Northamptonshire. We've talked about St Crispins Hospital. If you are born in Northamptonshire, St Crispins is a very, very well-known place. It has connotations. It has reputations. Some of those reputations aren't perhaps very pleasant, depending on what you were told. What do these items say about care and attitudes towards mental health support?
Every county in the country has an asylum or a place that the locals would know of, and it would be intrinsically linked to the local heritage, the local stories, both good and bad. There's a lot of myths surrounding these places. When I moved here for university, I heard about St Crispins. For example, I went to the first St Crispins fair. It was 1999, so it was a good couple of years after it closed. You know, there's these myths. I think mental health heritage and asylums and recognising the objects come out of asylums are really important, because I think they show the evolution of mental health care, not necessarily the progress. I think there's an interesting cyclical nature with mental health treatment and mental health attitudes that is almost one step forward, two steps back. It's very cyclical. So we make some progress and then we regress, and we make some progress and then we regress. And I think this object shows that. I think it shows the complexities of mental health heritage. I think it shows the complexities of these sites, and I think it shows the complexities of our relationship as local people to these places.
So charting perhaps changes in attitude, maybe a softening in attitude through the medium of soft toys made by people undergoing that care and that journey that we referenced earlier on. It's been fascinating to talk to you. Thank you in the first instance for being so open about your own experiences, and for telling me about these two rabbits dressed as they are from the era and that are now part of the exhibition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. It's been lovely speaking to you.
Thank you for listening to this Histories of Northamptonshire podcast. If you would like to find out more about the objects or listen to other episodes in the series, go to www.northamptonmuseums.com. Alternatively, you can visit the Northampton Museum and Art Gallery, where you can see the A History of Northamptonshire in 100 Objects exhibition for yourself. The Histories of Northamptonshire project is funded by Arts Council England as part of the National Portfolio Programme.